Back to Africa by Randall J. Moore and Christopher Munnion. Preface. The world has finally come to realize the plight of the African elephant. The once great herds that roamed the continent have been decimated by poachers seeking to satisfy the demand for ivory trinkets and human adornments. 10 years ago, there were possibly 1.5 million elephants throughout Africa. Today, they are thought to be fewer than 500,000. And conservationists estimate that they are being killed at the rate of 80,000 a year. A global ban on the ivory trade may or may not end the slaughter, but it will, ironically, have an adverse impact on the conservationist cause in countries like South Africa and Zimbabwe, which have the most effective game management policies in Africa. These countries, if present tense continue, will be among the very few places in the world where we will be able to see these magnificent animals like the elephant and the rhino in the wild by the turn of the century. A key part of this conservation strategy is the emotive policy of culling elephant herds to keep the numbers at a manageable level and to prevent their vast appetites destroying the habitats of many other species. Ivory yielded by the culls with other byproducts is sold on the world market, and the revenue is immediately ploughed back into other vital conservation projects. During the culling operations, the younger elephants are tranquilized and captured, later to be sold to wildlife parks, ranches, zoos and circuses around the world. Tsombe, Durga and Owala, the central characters of this elephant story, were among the first young African orphans to be sold to America, where I was privileged to meet them, to help train them, and eventually to become their custodian. My urge to return them to their African roots became something of an obsession. We succeeded, but the Back to Africa project was not without its detractors. If South Africa has to cull several hundred elephants a year, why try to rehabilitate 3 young survivors? Is it fair to take young circus-trained elephants, exposed to close contact with humans, and care for as domestic animals back into the African bush? These and many other pertinent questions were and still are thrown at me from all quarters. I hope the answers will be found in this book. The most compelling justification to my mind is that Owala and Durga not only readily adapted to the bush, but within months came to assume their natural role of matriarchs to a thriving herd of translocated juvenile elephants. We have destroyed, hopefully, the myth that African elephants cannot be trained. We have established that a pool of translocated young elephants can be reintroduced successfully into the wild, a factor which is surely one ray of hope in an otherwise dark future for the African elephant. I would also like to think that my close and prolonged contact with my former charges has led in some small way to a better understanding of this truly awesome, wonderful animal. Randall J. Moore, Transvaal, July 1989. Chapter 1. Close Encounters. We heard the sound as we emerged from the riverine forest and started to cross the broad savanna plain dotted with acacia thickets. It was the unmistakable tearing, crashing noise of elephants pushing down a tree. I had not expected a confrontation with the wild elephants quite so soon, but as they were here, we had to seize the opportunity. It was, after all, one of the main reasons for our long and eventful journey back to Africa. We were still downwind of the 5 wild ones, and as yet they had not picked up our scent or spotted us. The temptation to turn back to camp and avoid any contact was strong, but our curiosity was stronger. How would the 3 circus-trained African elephants we were riding react in close contact with their wild cousins? More importantly, what would be the wild elephant's reaction? It was an improbable confrontation. I was riding Tsombe, the bull, with my 2 assistants aboard the 2 females, Owala and Durga. Riding the former circus elephants into the middle of a wild herd in the heart of Africa may seem a little impetuous, but we had been training them, and ourselves, for this climatic event for more than a year. Tsombe, Durga and Awala had been born in the African wild, in South Africa's Kruger National Park. They had been captured as calves as part of an attempt to keep the elephant herds there at a manageable size. At the age of about 2 or 3 years, they had been darted with tranquilizers, sold to an American animal dealer, and then, barely weaned and utterly bewildered, had been crated and shipped to the totally alien environment of the United States. They were resold to a well-known dealer in wild animals in Washington state, in the mountainous northwest. He decided to train them as the first all-African elephant circus act in America. There was no doubt they had been loved and well cared for, but when I first met them in a snowbound wildlife park high in the Cascade Mountains, I could not help wondering what these magnificent creatures were doing so far from their natural home in Africa. All animals have individual characteristics, personalities, and idiosyncrasies. But in elephants, perhaps because of their size, these are more marked or come across more forcefully. Tombe, Durga, and Awala, the first African elephants I had ever seen, impressed me with their very own personalities from my first awestruck gaze. They were about 7 years old when I first became involved in their training. I suppose my character developed with theirs as we went on the circus circuit billed as the African Trio. Later, I found it easy to leave the circus life, but I could not forget the elephants. They had become my closest friends, and I sensed somehow that the rest of my life would be bound up with theirs. A few years later, I inherited the African Trio. My initial concern about elephants being shipped away from their natural habitat became something of an obsession. My three, I decided, would have to be reintroduced to the African wild. It would be difficult, dangerous, and expensive, and it had to my knowledge never been tried before. But for my children, as I now regarded them, I would give it my best shot. Now here we were, on the edge of Tsavo, one of Africa's largest national parks, and for many years home to some of the largest herds of elephants. We had been here for only 4 days, but already we were in contact with the wild ones. I was full of apprehension, and yet Tsombe beneath me was straining eagerly to push ahead for a closer inspection of the 5 animals busily browsing on the acacia. I was desperately trying to conceal my anxiety from the bull. Elephants are highly intelligent and sensitive creatures, and my lack of confidence could easily be conveyed to him through the seat of my pants and his thick skin. At this stage, Tombe was 15 years old and weighed about 3,000 kilograms. Each of his 1.22 meter tusks weighed some 15 kilograms and were deeply curved and well formed. He was headstrong and independent. I admired these male qualities in him, which was probably why I had chosen to ride him rather than either of the 2 cows. Tombe could have asserted himself physically over Awala, the dominant cow, at any time, and yet he was quite content to let her lead the pack, to be the matriarch and protector. As long as he had his independence, whenever he felt he needed it, he was tolerant, indulgent, and even. Awala, another teenager, was already a natural elephant matriarch. Any situation which threatened her little family would find her right up front challenging, trumpeting, and demanding that it be known she was in control. Any intruder would have to answer to her. She too was headstrong, but always in a protective way. By contrast, Durga was completely submissive and docile. She was the same size as the other 2, but her rounded cherubic features and long eyelashes made her the Dumbo-like character of the group. All elephants have eyelashes to make them the envy of most women, but Durga's were particularly striking, and she could and would flutter them in the most alluring way. She, I knew, would be by far the most nervous of the 3 in any encounters in the wild. The wild 5 were still browsing on the freshly felled thorn tree, seemingly unaware of our presence. With a mixture of trepidation and rising excitement, I tried to anticipate their reaction when they became aware of us. Would the meeting be successful? Would it be worthwhile? I was responsible for returning my three to the African wild, and I simply had to make it work. It was a daunting task. Chombe was only too keen to investigate, but I restrained him, knowing that a sudden confrontation would startle the resident herd and possibly cause an accident. I motioned to my assistants to hold their charges in check at a distance while I rode Chombe cautiously forward, urging him quietly and earnestly to be steady. As the distance closed, I had my first good look at the wild elephants. There was a fully grown cow whose age I estimated to be somewhere between 30 and 40 years. She did not have the deep temporal indentations on each side of the head that really old cows and bulls develop in later life. Her physical condition was excellent and she had an impressive pair of tusks. Standing next to her was a young bull whose age I estimated at about 10 and a cow of about 12. The other two were also youngsters, a bull of about 12 and a cow aged about 8. Clearly all these calves could not belong to the matriarch. Quite possibly this was one of the fragmented groups that had survived a drought and a tidal wave of poaching in this part of Africa. The matriarch seemed in my anxious state to grow larger and larger as we approached. At 50 meters she picked up our scent. Her trunk raised like a periscope in our direction. Chombe was completely unconcerned, or at least giving a very good impression of being so. Every few meters I would motion him to a halt and he would immediately begin browsing. At 30 meters the elder stateswoman let out a deep guttural growl, while the little bull beside her followed up with a trumpet that sounded like a leaking balloon. Chombe did not respond. To avoid the possibility of upsetting the herd by using my voice, I relied on my bullhook, the spurred stick of the type that has been used in Asia for centuries to push, pull and guide the trained elephant. Another 10 meters and I fought to control my nerves. I ordered Chombe to halt. He did, dead in his tracks, and then raised his trunk and elongated it in the direction of the herd. This was it. The next few minutes would reveal just how my trained elephants would adjust to the wild, and how the wild elephants would react to them, particularly with a relatively frail biologist on board. The sun was now up, but that didn't fully explain the sweat pouring off me. I fumbled with my camera, telling myself that I had to record this historic moment, but acknowledging quietly that I needed desperately to do something with my hands. My heart seemed to hit my stomach as the matriarch suddenly emitted an ear-splitting scream, simultaneously kicking up loose dirt with her huge front foot and sending up a cloud of hot, dry dust that enveloped us all. Then she lowered her head, curled up her trunk, and lunged forward with her ears flared wide, a mock charge. Beside her, the small bull mimicked a threat display, while the other three remained in a submissive posture, their rear ends pointing towards us. The matriarch repeated her threatening mock charge, but Chombe remained calm, reaching out with his trunk to browse on the vegetation with what I thought to be an affected air of disinterest. The little bull stood his ground only for so long and returned to his young brothers and sisters, studiously pointing with their backside displayed to the exchange. Behind me, I was aware that a wala was having to be restrained from joining this encounter. Durga seemed content to browse and leave these silly games to the others. So far, so good. The matriarch was still kicking up a lot of dust and noise and wheeling her trunk in some fearsome threat display. But thanks to Chombe's cool, calm and collected manner, I regained my confidence and together we moved forward again. From a distance of 10 meters, I became fully aware just how large the wild cow was. She was a good 3 meters at the shoulder, and from my new vantage point, I had to aim my camera upwards to get even a portion of her massive frame in focus. In her presence, Chombe was a relative lightweight. Trying to hold the camera steady, I continued to snap off photographs as the matriarch blustered, trumpeted, and flapped her ears ferociously and made several further mock charges. Her message was trumpeted loud and clear through the forest and well into the plains beyond. I was very familiar with the sound, but at that moment it held for me a special thrill, one I would never forget. More than anything else, it still describes to me the agony and the ecstasy of the African bush. The tip of the matriarch's trunk was only a couple of meters away, flailing angrily. I was still scared, but I knew now that we were not going to have a fight. Chombe had done me proud. He had remained unnerved by this massive show of threat, noise and dust, and in my books had won on points this first encounter with a much larger wild cousin, who now turned and ran away from us, closely followed by a young entourage. About 50 meters away they stopped and regrouped in another acacia thicket, silent and alert. Chombe, his curiosity far from satisfied, set off to follow, but I restrained him. The old cow was still visibly upset, and most certainly we were not here to cause any stress to the wild residents. We left the little herd browsing in the shade of the forest. When we returned to the area that evening, they had crossed the river and moved on. I was fully confident that we would soon have further encounters. Early the following morning, Durga and Owala had their chance to meet some more wild cousins. Two enormous bulls hurried across the plain to check out the new girls on the block, as my two were browsing, unridden, near the river. Owala characteristically met the challenge with one of her own, and was greeted with some respect. But Durga, pretty plump Durga, seemed to be the lady of their choice, and they gave her a thorough examination, leaving her petrified before adjourning to the river bank to spar along and heavily with each other, apparently to establish who should have the benefit of her favors. They were an exhilarating first few days, and were to be followed by many more encounters between Chombe, Durga, and Owala, and the many species of wild animals in this part of Africa. From the start, they had shown an instinctive aptitude for readaptation to the wild, even though they had been taken from Africa at a very young age and had lived in captivity ever since. They were relaxed and content, and more at home with each day that we rode them further and further into the bush. Perhaps my dream of reintroducing them into the African wild would become a reality much sooner than I had dared to hope for.